They're quiet, reflective, observant, but beneath that calm exterior is a storm no one sees. Intuitive introverts don't live on the surface. They live underground, deep in the soil of thought, memory, and sensation. They are not just shy or reserved. They are absorbing, deconstructing, haunted by meaning in a world that seems content with noise. You've seen them before. They speak less, but when they do, their words cut deeper than most. They walk away from parties not because they dislike people, but because being around too many emotions is like standing in the middle of 1,000 screaming radios. They need silence, not just to rest but to survive. Carl Jung called this type the introverted intuitive. And he believed that their suffering was not only common, it was inevitable. Not because they are broken, but because they are tuned into frequencies that most people never notice. Where others see events, they see patterns. Where others chase success, they search for meaning. Where others find comfort in belonging, they feel most alive in solitude. But this depth comes with a cost, because the modern world was not built for them. It was built for speed, for visibility, for performance. A world where being loud is rewarded, where simplicity is praised, where sensitivity is mocked. So the intuitive introvert learns early on to hide, to smile when they're overwhelmed, to nod when they disagree, to shrink their thoughts so they don't scare people away. And over time they begin to doubt themselves. They begin to think, maybe I am too much. Maybe I do overthink everything. Maybe I'm just wrong for this world. But they're not wrong. They're just rare. This section isn't just about being introverted. It's about carrying the burden of inner truth in a culture obsessed with surface. It's about the silent pain of knowing too much, feeling too deeply, and yet never quite being seen. Because when your reality is built on insight, and the world demands simplicity, suffering becomes inevitable. But Jung would argue, this isn't a flaw, it's a calling. To suffer deeply is often to see clearly. And those who see clearly will always feel apart, before they feel free. Carl Jung didn't just study the mind, he studied the soul. And he believed that the deeper one's inner life, the more likely they are to feel alienated from the world. Because society doesn't make space for depth, it fears it. According to Jung, the intuitive introvert navigates the world through images, metaphors, archetypes, and inner visions. They are not just reacting to events, they are decoding meaning beneath them. They live in the symbolic, not just the literal. But here's the tragedy. The modern world runs on consensus reality, the shared agreement of what's real, important, and valid. And intuitive introverts? They often see beyond that consensus. They question the news cycle. They distrust surface explanations. They sense emotional undercurrents in conversations others barely notice. They feel the falseness in smiling faces, the tension in social norms, the emptiness in what others call normal. Jung called this the individual path of the self. The path that veers away from the collective and into the unknown. But walking that path is lonely, because the world is terrified of people who see too clearly. And when you see through things, institutions, masks, even your own illusions, people start to feel threatened by you. They say you're too intense, too serious, too negative. In reality, you're just honest. But that honesty isolates you, because society prefers people who fit in, not people who reflect its shadows back at it. Jung warned that the process of individuation, becoming who you truly are, often begins with a deep, almost unbearable solitude. He wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." This is why intuitive introverts suffer so quietly. Not because they're alone, but because no one seems to understand what they're really trying to say. They crave connection, not with bodies but with minds. They want truth, not performance. They want silence, not small talk. They want to belong, but only if it doesn't cost them their authenticity. And so, many of them retreat, not out of bitterness, but as a survival mechanism. Because to keep showing up in a world that doesn't value depth is to slowly lose touch with your own. Jung's theory reminds us, the deeper you go into yourself, the further you drift from the crowd. But that drift, that distance, is not failure. It's part of the transformation. Before you can return to the world as your true self, you must first survive the exile of your false one. This is the suffering of the intuitive introvert. To see what others won't, to feel what others can't, and to walk through the darkness alone, until they emerge with a light only they can carry. You wake up tired. You walk into a world too loud, too fast, too shallow. And you wonder, why can't I function like everyone else? Carl Jung would answer simply, because you weren't meant to. The modern world, industrial, extroverted, commercialized, was not designed for depth. It was engineered for output, for stimulation, for constant noise. Everything about it, from its schools to its work schedules, its media, its social values, rewards extroversion. Speed is praised. Sociability is worshipped. Conformity is incentivized. But you move differently. You think before you speak. You feel everything before it makes sense. You ask questions that others don't want to hear. And the system punishes you for it. Not overtly, but subtly. In your job reviews. In your classroom grades. In your relationships. You're too quiet. You're too sensitive. You overthink everything. Translation? You don't fit the mold. And that mold, the architecture of modern life, wasn't built with you in mind. It was built for fast responders, quick talkers, efficient producers, people who do more than they feel. But intuitive introverts aren't wired for that. They need reflection. They need silence. They need space to process the invisible, the dreams, the fears, the emotional undercurrents that swirl beneath the surface. They don't just work. They interpret their work. They don't just socialize. They analyze the energy of a room before they speak. Jung believed that our suffering often comes not from who we are, but from how violently we are forced to adapt. This constant adaptation, this masking, is exhausting. You smile when you want to scream. You attend meetings when you want solitude. You perform normality when every cell in your body feels overwhelmed. You learn to fake being functional, not to thrive but to survive. But something deeper suffers. Your soul. Jung called this spiritual trauma. The slow erosion of authenticity under the weight of social expectations. He warned that if you adapt for too long, you lose touch with your inner voice. The voice that says, "This isn't me. I need rest. I need truth. I need silence." But that voice gets buried. Beneath deadlines. Beneath social etiquette. Beneath the fear of being too much or not enough. So you shrink. Not physically, but energetically. And the world applauds your ability to keep showing up. To keep performing. To keep pretending. But inside you're wilting. Because no matter how much effort you put in, you still feel like you're falling short. Not because you're broken, but because you're playing a game that was never meant for people like you. And here's the most painful part. You start to blame yourself. You wonder if you're lazy, weak, unmotivated. You're not. You are simply misaligned with a system that prioritizes productivity over presence, noise over nuance, efficiency over essence. Jung believed that the intuitive introvert is not a failure of the system. They are a symptom of its sickness. Your suffering is not your weakness. It's your signal. A signal that something is wrong. Not with you, but with the world you're being asked to conform to. And until we build systems that make space for depth, for silence, for sensitivity, the intuitive introvert will keep suffering in plain sight, smiling in group photos, nodding in meetings, withdrawing in private, not because they're antisocial, but because they're exhausted. And Jung would tell you, that exhaustion is sacred. It means your soul still refuses to be sold, still resists the machinery, still whispers that your path, though lonely, is real. You're not failing. You're awakening. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." But what if you already see the unconscious? What if your entire life feels like standing beneath an emotional X-ray machine, unable to turn it off? This is the paradox of the intuitive introvert. Your gift is insight, but that gift doesn't always feel like a blessing. You walk into a room and sense the tension before a single word is spoken. You hear what someone isn't saying more loudly than what they are. You carry the emotional residue of conversations long after they've ended. Most people skate on the surface. You dive into the deep. But the deeper you see, the heavier it becomes. You can't unsee hypocrisy. You can't ignore falseness. You can't participate in shallow rituals without feeling like a fraud. And the world, which runs on surface interactions, small talk, status, performance, feels like a place you're only pretending to belong. This leads to something Jung would call psychic overload. Too much perception. Too many signals. Too many layers of reality being absorbed at once. It's not that you're antisocial. You're overstimulated. It's not that you're negative. You're real. You see the cracks in the system. You sense the lies people tell themselves to function. And worst of all, you feel obligated to pretend you don't. This is why intuitive introverts often suffer in silence. Not because they're broken, but because they understand too much. They know that someone's anger is really fear. That their partner's "I'm fine" means "I'm hurt." That the loudest person in the room is usually the most insecure. And once you see that, it becomes difficult to trust anything on the surface. This creates a constant internal conflict. Do you speak the truth and risk alienation? Or stay silent and betray yourself? Jung believed this is where neurosis is born. In the split between what we perceive and what we express. When we see reality but feel unable to reflect it outwardly, we begin to fragment inside. You become tired not from life itself, but from hiding your understanding of it. This is the weight of overperception. You're always decoding, always translating, always processing, but rarely feeling seen. Because the world doesn't value intuition as a form of intelligence. It values certainty, confidence, fast answers, and your knowing is slow, quiet, hard to explain. You don't just know, you feel. And Jung would argue that feeling is one of the most profound forms of knowing, but also the most easily dismissed. So you begin to doubt yourself. You ask, why am I always overwhelmed? Why does everyone else seem fine? Why can't I just be normal? But here's the truth. You were never meant to be normal. You were meant to see. And that seeing has a cost. Because once you start living at the level of intuition, you can no longer settle for surface answers, surface relationships, or surface identities. You crave depth. And that craving can make the world feel unbearably hollow. This is why intuitive introverts often feel both wise and broken, both gifted and cursed. You carry truths no one asked you to carry. You feel the pain no one else is willing to name. You notice the wounds others deny. And the worst part? You think it's your fault. But it's not. It's your nature. Jung believed that the task of the intuitive was not to shut down, but to integrate their perception without being destroyed by it. Most people want to fit in, but intuitive introverts? They want to belong. And there's a difference. Fitting in means shaping yourself to be accepted. Belonging means being accepted as you are. Carl Jung warned that modern life, especially in collectivist or conformist cultures, often demands the suppression of the individual self. And for the intuitive introvert, this becomes a prison. You don't just struggle with crowds. You struggle with expectations, with social roles, with the unspoken rules that govern interaction. You find yourself in a room full of people, yet feel utterly alone. You smile when you're supposed to, nod during the right parts, laugh on cue. But internally, you're floating, disconnected from the script everyone else seems to follow effortlessly. It's not that you don't care about people. You care deeply. But the version of connection you crave? It's rare. It's sacred. It's real. And most of what the world offers feels like a watered-down substitute. Jung believed that the deeper the individual's psyche, the harder it is to find resonance in the external world. So you start to retreat. Not because you hate people, but because you hate pretending. You hate having to mask your true thoughts to avoid disturbing the peace. You hate shrinking your complexity to fit someone's expectations. And each time you do it, something inside you erodes. There's a voice that whispers, "This isn't me. This isn't real. This isn't safe." But no one else seems bothered. Everyone else seems fine. So you start to wonder, is something wrong with me? You look for belonging but find performance. You crave intimacy but encounter image. And that mismatch, between what you seek and what exists, creates a silent kind of grief. You mourn the depth that never comes. The conversations that never go beyond surface level. The souls you never get to meet. Because everyone is too busy playing roles. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to function in society. But for the intuitive introvert, the mask doesn't just itch. It suffocates. Because your real face is full of questions, emotions, insights. And none of it fits neatly into what the world expects. This is why your solitude feels like sanity. Only in solitude can you be unmasked. Only there do you find the permission to think deeply, to feel freely, to exist without translation. But here's the paradox. The more you retreat to protect your authenticity, the more disconnected you feel from others. You want connection, but you can't tolerate the fakeness that often comes with it. You want love, but not the kind that asks you to be less. So you hover in limbo, too deep for the shallow, too intense for the casual, too awake for the scripted. And it hurts, because even though you know your standards are valid, you still long to be seen, to be met, to be mirrored in your wholeness. But you're not mirrored, you're misunderstood, called too sensitive, too much, or worse, cold, simply because you protect your energy. Jung would say this is not a flaw. It's a spiritual wound, inflicted by a culture that rewards conformity over consciousness. And healing it begins with redefining belonging, not as something the world gives you, but as something you create from within. Belonging isn't about being accepted everywhere. It's about being true somewhere. Even if that somewhere starts with you, alone, whole, and deeply honest. Because the moment you stop chasing external validation and start honoring your internal reality, you begin to build a life where disconnection is no longer the default. You begin to attract people, places, and moments that resonate with your inner frequency. You begin to trust that solitude is not a punishment, but a portal, a passage back to your true tribe. And you realize you were never meant to belong everywhere. You were meant to belong where the real ones are, where masks fall, where depth rises, where your truth is home. Carl Jung believed that sensitivity wasn't weakness, it was a heightened form of perception, an antenna for truth, a radar for what others ignore. But in a world that rewards numbness, speed, and superficiality, sensitivity is punished. The intuitive introvert feels too much, thinks too deeply, notices too many things. You walk into a room and feel the tension before a word is spoken. You sense the sadness behind a smile. You hear the manipulation buried inside polite conversation. And while others brush it off, you absorb it. You carry invisible weights. It's not just your emotions, it's everyone's. You notice what's left unsaid. You feel the chaos underneath calm appearances. You sense betrayal before it happens. And that constant awareness, it drains you. Not because you're fragile, but because you were never taught how to filter. You were told to toughen up, to stop overreacting, to let it go. But Jung knew that what society dismisses as overreacting is often just accurate reacting. In a culture that has lost touch with its own depth, you don't react too much. You just notice too much. And because others don't see it, they invalidate you, making you question your own reality. Over time, that doubt eats away at you. You begin to silence yourself. You stop trusting your inner compass. You downplay your instincts just to fit in. And the result? Burnout. Not just physical exhaustion, existential exhaustion. Because when your nervous system is constantly alert, when your soul is constantly translating the unspoken, when your truth is constantly dismissed, you start to shut down. The world tells you that you're too soft, too intense, too emotional. But what Jung might say is this: you are not too much for the world. The world has simply become too little for the soul. In a society that values output over insight, appearance over authenticity, noise over nuance, your sensitivity becomes a rebellion. It threatens the illusion. It disrupts the performance. It calls attention to the rot behind the gloss. And that's why it's so often rejected. There's a quiet difference between being alone and feeling alone. One is a sanctuary, the other, a prison. Carl Jung understood this better than most. He believed that solitude wasn't something to fear. It was the birthplace of the true self. But in modern society, being alone is pathologized. If you're not surrounded by noise, attention, or constant stimulation, something must be wrong with you. Yet for intuitive introverts, aloneness isn't loneliness. It's medicine. When the world becomes too loud, too fake, too shallow, you retreat. Not to escape, but to reconnect. Your solitude becomes a sacred act, a rebellion against the performance, a return to what is real. You sit in silence and begin to hear your own voice again, unfiltered, unmasked, unapologetic. But the culture doesn't understand this. They say, you're too distant. You need to be more social. Why don't you come out of your shell? What they don't realize is that your shell isn't a cage. It's a cathedral. Inside it, you grieve, you reflect, you integrate, and eventually, you grow. Jung believed that without solitude, there is no individuation, no discovery of the inner self, no confrontation with the shadow. In other words, you cannot become who you are until you're willing to be alone with who you've been. But here's the paradox. The very aloneness that heals you can also hurt you. If you start believing that your withdrawal makes you unworthy, if you mistake your quiet for absence, your depth for defect, your boundaries for rejection, this is where isolation creeps in. Not from others, but from within. You start questioning your right to be different. You wonder if maybe, just maybe, they're right. That you're too intense, too complicated, too sensitive. And slowly you begin to internalize the judgment. You carry the weight of the world's discomfort with your truth. But Jung would urge you to remember, the soul does not grow in crowds. It grows in the wilderness, in the silence, in the moments when everything external is stripped away, and all that remains is your essence. This is the gift of aloneness, not isolation, not exile, but return. Return to your original self, the one not shaped by applause, not diluted by conformity, not fragmented by approval seeking. When you learn to sit with yourself, to witness your fears without fleeing, to hold your pain without numbing, to listen to your heart without censorship, you begin to build a kind of inner home that no loneliness can breach. And from that home, you can finally love without losing yourself, connect without contorting, give without guilt, because now, you're not caring to be seen. You're caring from a place that's rooted, full, and sovereign. So if you ever feel like your solitude is a flaw, remember this. The world is afraid of those who are whole without it. But those are the ones who change it. You walk into rooms that drain you. You sit in meetings that numb you. You scroll through a world that feels too loud, too shallow, too fast. And at some point you begin to wonder, is there something wrong with me? Carl Jung would say, no, there's something wrong with the world. You see, society wasn't designed for the intuitive introvert. It was built by and for the extroverted ideal. The loud, the visible, the aggressively productive. In this world, value is measured in volume. How much you produce, how often you speak, how easily you fit in. But what if you were never meant to fit in? Jung believed that every person holds a unique psychological blueprint. And for intuitive introverts, that blueprint is built for depth, not speed. For meaning, not metrics. For inner truth, not outer approval. You don't thrive in fluorescent offices or 5-second conversations. You thrive in long silences, in difficult questions, in untamed thoughts that stretch beyond the boundaries of polite society. But that's exactly why the world resists you. Because you see what others ignore. You feel what others deny. You question what others accept. You are not easily fooled, not easily entertained, not easily controlled. And in a world that survives on illusion, that makes you dangerous. So instead of embracing your depth, they pathologize it. You're called too sensitive, too intense, too much. But Jung would ask, too much for what? For a culture built on masks and noise? Maybe the problem isn't that you're too much. Maybe it's that the world has grown too shallow to hold your truth. Here's what they won't tell you. Your suffering is not a defect, it's data. It's a signal from the psyche that something is out of alignment. You're not meant to adapt to a system that drains you. You're meant to question it, to outgrow it, to build something deeper in its place. This is your superpower. You feel too much because you're wired for meaning. You withdraw because your mind needs space to expand. You ache because you see the cracks in the collective illusion. And through those cracks, light enters. That light, your perception, your wisdom, your resistance. It can heal. Not just you, but others too. Because intuitive introverts don't just survive the world's madness. They reveal it. And in doing so, they offer an alternative. Not louder, not faster, but truer. So the next time you feel like an alien, the next time the noise makes you question your worth, remember, you weren't made to follow the world. You were made to remake it, from the inside out. There are days you wake up and feel everything. The tension in the room. The sadness in a stranger's voice. The unspoken truth hiding behind someone's smile. You feel it all. And it's exhausting. The world tells you this is a weakness. That you're too emotional. Too delicate. Too reactive. But Carl Jung would disagree. He'd say your sensitivity isn't a flaw. It's a portal. A gateway into the unconscious. Because what most people avoid, you absorb. What most people suppress, you sense. And yes, that makes life heavier. But it also makes your insight deeper. You see, sensitivity is a form of intelligence. Not the kind that gets rewarded in school or applauded in meetings. But the kind that notices what others miss. That understands before words are spoken. That recognizes truth beneath layers of denial. It's a radar tuned to the frequencies of the soul. But here's the danger. When sensitivity isn't protected, it becomes suffering. When your empathy goes unmanaged, it becomes enmeshment. And when you feel too much without grounding, you lose yourself in everyone else's chaos. Jung warned about this. He believed that without boundaries, the sensitive soul gets devoured. You begin to confuse your feelings with theirs. You begin to heal others at the cost of your own wholeness. That's not compassion. That's self-erasure. So how do you protect your gift? First, you name it. You stop calling yourself weak. You stop apologizing for your tears. You stop hiding your tenderness to survive a brutal world. Then you create sacred space. Space to recharge. Space to think. Space to remember who you are when no one else is pulling at your energy. Because strength isn't just about force. It's about protection. And protection means limits. You start saying no. Not out of anger, but from awareness. You start pulling back. Not out of withdrawal, but to realign. You start choosing silence. Not because you're defeated, but because your energy deserves precision. And here's the shift. Your sensitivity becomes power. Not when you numb it, but when you channel it. You begin to speak with clarity. To feel with purpose. To move through the world not as a sponge, but as a mirror. You reflect truth back to people. You reflect light into darkness. You reflect humanity into systems that have forgotten how to feel. This is what the world needs now. Not more noise. Not more numbness. But people who dare to feel. And who know how to protect that gift like a sacred flame. Because that's what your sensitivity is. Not a burden. A flame. And you're here to carry it through the storm. In a world obsessed with loudness, the quiet ones are often dismissed. They don't interrupt. They don't dominate. They don't fight for the spotlight. And so, they're underestimated. But Carl Jung believed something radically different. He saw that introverts aren't just quiet. They are deep. Where others chase validation, the introvert turns inward. Not to escape the world, but to understand it. This is the forgotten strength of the intuitive introvert. They don't just react. They reflect. They don't just follow. They analyze. They don't just consume information. They alchemize it. And what emerges from this process is a kind of internal compass. A voice that whispers not what is popular, but what is true. But here's the paradox. The quieter that voice is, the harder it is to hear it in a world that never stops shouting. Social media demands speed. The culture demands noise. And opinions flood in faster than thought. So, the introvert becomes overwhelmed, not because they're weak, but because their gift requires silence to thrive. This is why many intuitive introverts suffer. Not because they lack strength, but because their strength is invisible. The modern world doesn't reward reflection. It rewards reaction. It doesn't seek insight. It seeks immediacy. And so, the introvert's wisdom is often drowned beneath performance. But Jung would urge you to resist, to turn down the world, and tune into the self. Because inside that silence is something extraordinary. An intuition honed through solitude. A wisdom born from observation. A voice uncorrupted by groupthink. This inner voice doesn't scream. It doesn't beg to be heard. It speaks in symbols. In dreams. In strange urges to walk away from the crowd. And when you listen, really listen, you begin to realize, you've known the truth all along. The decisions that felt wrong, you knew. The people who drained you, you sensed it. The paths that never fit, you felt that friction in your bones. You just weren't taught to trust it. Because society teaches obedience, not inner authority. It teaches conformity, not self-alignment. But intuitive introverts are not here to conform. They are here to see beneath, to feel deeper, to understand what others can't even name. This is your gift. And when you stop judging your quiet, when you stop apologizing for your slowness, when you stop trying to be louder just to survive, you'll hear it, the inner voice. And in that moment, you'll know what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not louder, not faster, not more likable, just aligned." We live in a culture addicted to surfaces, followers over depth, aesthetics over authenticity, noise over nuance. And in this environment, the intuitive introvert feels like an alien. You ask deep questions, but get shallow answers. You want meaning, but the world gives you marketing. You long for stillness, but the machine demands constant motion. It's no wonder you often feel like something's wrong with you. But Carl Jung would say, there's nothing wrong with you. There's something deeply wrong with the world. You are not broken. You are simply incompatible with the shallowness around you. And the cure is not to shrink yourself to fit, is to reclaim the very depth they tried to shame out of you. Because the truth is, the world needs your depth, even if it doesn't know it yet. It needs your ability to hold paradox, to question appearances, to pause when everyone else rushes in. But to reclaim that depth, you must first give yourself permission. Permission to walk away from conversations that exhaust you. Permission to decline invitations that drain you. Permission to stay curious in a culture that pretends to know everything. You have to stop waiting for the world to validate your nature. It won't. It doesn't know how. So you have to validate it yourself. You have to make your inner world your home. Build rituals around silence. Protect your time like a sacred fire. Let boredom and slowness become the soil where insight grows. Because when you stop rushing to catch up with everyone else, you'll realize you were never behind. You were just walking a different path. A path that winds inward. A path that doesn't always make sense to others. A path that leads not to popularity, but to wholeness. And that is the path of the intuitive introvert. Jung called it individuation. The journey of becoming not what the world wants, but what your soul already is. This is not a rebellion. It's a return. Not an escape from the world, but a refusal to be hollowed by it. And in that refusal, you don't become colder. You become real. Grounded, complex, unshakable. The world might still chase shallowness, but you'll be rooted in something much harder to find, and far more powerful, your depth. There's a strange liberation in being unseen. At first, it feels like rejection, like invisibility is a curse, like being overlooked means you don't matter. But Carl Jung would offer another perspective. Being unseen is the space where the real self is born. Because when no one's watching, you're no longer performing. When no one's applauding, you're no longer addicted to approval. When no one's mirroring you, you start to see who you really are. And what you find isn't fragile. It's not desperate. It's not lacking. It's whole. Modern society thrives on visibility, on broadcasting identity, branding your soul, turning every moment into content. But for intuitive introverts, visibility can feel like exposure. Like your essence is being diluted. Your meaning turned into performance. So when the world overlooks you, you're given a sacred opportunity to grow roots instead of branches, to deepen instead of display, to listen inward instead of shouting outward. Jung called this the path of individuation, where you shed the false self that was built for others, and reclaim the true self that was waiting in the silence. This isn't loneliness, it's solitude. And in solitude you don't vanish, you clarify. You discover that your value was never in how loudly you spoke, but in how deeply you understood. Not in how many people clapped, but in how honest you were when no one was clapping at all. Being unseen is not the end. It's the beginning of becoming real. And once you find your power in that unseen space, no one can take it from you. Because now your self-worth isn't outsourced. It's internal, immovable. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need the spotlight, because you've already lit the fire within. And the world? It might still misunderstand you. It might still overlook you. It might still call you quiet, distant, aloof. But none of that will matter anymore. Because when you've faced your inner world, when you've learned to love yourself in the silence, you've already won. And ironically, it's in the moment you no longer need to be seen, that the world begins to see you. Clearly, truly, finally. Not as a role. not as a brand, but as you.